A crowded airplane cabin, passengers settling in for a long journey. But in one corner of the plane, a white woman's eyes narrow as she fixates on a black man seated nearby. Every movement, every glance he makes seems to her out of place. Unable to hold back her prejudice, she begins openly humiliating him, convinced he doesn't belong. But what she doesn't know is that his true identity will leave her utterly shocked and challenge every assumption she's made. Will her prejudice lead to a lesson she never expected? Watch as a single moment of discrimination unfolds, leaving everyone on board stunned. David Lewis stepped onto Flight 287, his gaze briefly sweeping the bustling cabin. People were standing in the aisle, lifting bags, settling into seats, and chatting with neighbors. David moved smoothly through the crowd, muttering a quick, "Excuse me," here and there, as he made his way to a seat near the emergency exit, a few rows back. He felt relieved to reach his spot, hoping for a peaceful flight. Across the aisle, Michelle Grant lowered her magazine just enough to observe David over the top edge. He'd caught her eye the instant he stepped on board, his calm demeanor somehow commanding attention. Her curiosity was piqued as she noticed how he settled in, checking his bag with precise care, although she couldn't pinpoint why something about him felt off. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, the article she'd been reading now completely forgotten. After a few moments of silent observation, Michelle raised her hand, calling for the flight attendant. Linda, a warm and experienced crew member, approached her with a friendly smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" she asked. Michelle cast a quick glance at David, who was now flipping through the pages of a book. She leaned closer to Linda, her voice hushed. "That man by the emergency exit, are you sure it's safe for him to sit there?" Linda's gaze followed Michelle's to where David sat, engrossed in his book. Her professional smile remained steady. "I assure you, ma'am, everyone on board has been through security, and our seating arrangements are compliant with all safety regulations." Michelle's lips pressed together, unsatisfied with the answer. "It's just, with everything in the news, it doesn't hurt to be cautious, right?" Linda's polite smile held, though there was a slight narrowing of her eyes, nearly imperceptible. "Of course, if you have any specific concerns, we'd be happy to address them. We want all passengers to feel comfortable." With a polite nod, Linda continued down the aisle, but Michelle's irritation lingered. How could they be so dismissive? She glanced back at David, who had put his book down briefly to reach into his bag. Her heart quickened. What was he looking for in there? David, completely oblivious to the scrutiny, reached into his carry-on to check his medication label, ensuring he had the right dosage for his trip. Satisfied, he tucked the bottle back and resumed reading, his mind slowly unwinding from the stress of the previous week. In the back of the plane, Linda caught the eye of her colleague James and leaned closer to him. "Keep an eye on seat 18B, she whispered. "Passenger in 22C seems a bit edgy about him." James nodded, curiosity flickering in his expression. "What's going on?" "Nothing specific," Linda replied with a small shrug. "Just one of those gut feelings. Not sure if it'll turn into anything, but we've been around long enough to recognize potential." Back in her seat, Michelle felt increasingly agitated as she kept her gaze locked on David. Every time he shifted or reached for his bag, her suspicions grew. To her, this man's actions felt calculated, each movement layered with intent. As the engines revved up, signaling takeoff, David finally closed his book and looked out the window, visibly relaxing. But Michelle's mind raced. She could almost feel the tension tightening in her chest as she tried to shake the sense of foreboding creeping over her. If no one else would do anything, she told herself, maybe she'd have to. Flight 287 leveled off smoothly, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board and briefing them on the flight route. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime, and passengers around the cabin began settling into their routines. Laptops clicked open, books were brought out, and a few travelers settled into in-flight movies. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, checking in on passengers and offering refreshments. David leaned back in his seat, casting a casual glance out the window at the rolling clouds below. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, his mind retreating from the pressures of work and into a rare moment of calm. He reached down, unzipped his carry-on bag, and retrieved a small water bottle. As he did, he noticed Michelle's stare from a few rows away. He paused momentarily but then dismissed it, assuming she was just glancing around the cabin as people often do. Michelle's anxiety only grew as she observed David. She watched him zip his bag back up with care after taking a sip of water. To her, it seemed like he was overly concerned with keeping his belongings tightly secured. Why did he keep checking the bag? What could he possibly be hiding? Unable to shake the sense of unease, Michelle raised her hand once more, signaling Linda as she passed by. Linda approached her, offering a gentle smile. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something you need?" Michelle leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That man up near the emergency exit. I've been watching him. He keeps checking that bag of his like he's nervous about something inside. Don't you think that's suspicious?" Linda's gaze drifted to David briefly before she returned her calm attention to Michelle. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but as I mentioned before, we cannot interfere with a passenger's belongings without due cause. So far, he's done nothing to suggest a reason for alarm." Michelle's jaw tightened. "Normal? People like him always act normal until they don't. I've seen it on the news. They blend in, act relaxed, but it's a cover," she said with conviction. "We can't just ignore this. What if he's carrying something dangerous?" Linda took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "Ma'am, we follow strict security protocols, and all passengers go through screenings before boarding. Please, try to relax and enjoy the flight. But if you observe any concrete reason for concern, don't hesitate to let us know." Michelle crossed her arms, irritation flashing in her eyes. "You flight attendants never take anything seriously until it's too late," she muttered under her breath as Linda walked away. Watching Linda's polite retreat, Michelle shook her head, feeling increasingly frustrated. She glanced around, noticing that a few passengers had turned their attention toward her during the exchange. They seemed to have dismissed her as overly cautious and quickly returned to their own activities. With each uninterested face she saw, Michelle's annoyance grew. How could everyone be so oblivious? Trying to find an ally, Michelle leaned over to the man sitting beside her, an elderly gentleman immersed in a crossword puzzle. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Have you noticed the man by the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem off to you?" The elderly man looked up, momentarily taken aback, and followed her gaze to where David sat. After a quick glance, he returned to his crossword with a shake of his head. "Seems fine to me. Probably just keeping to himself." Michelle's frustration intensified as she looked around for anyone who might see the situation as she did. Her gaze landed on a young woman seated across the aisle, who had noticed her glancing over and raised a questioning brow. Michelle leaned toward her, lowering her voice. "Did you see the man by the exit? He's been acting strange ever since we boarded. Doesn't it feel off?" The young woman glanced at David, then back at Michelle, her expression polite but clearly uncomfortable. He just looks like he's reading," she replied carefully. "Is something wrong?" Michelle's patience snapped. "Yes, there is. He's been watching that bag like he's hiding something. I tried to tell the flight attendant, but they don't seem to care." Her voice took on a sharper edge as she spoke, trying to rally the young woman's support. "Isn't it better to be safe than sorry?" The young woman shifted in her seat, now clearly uneasy. "I think it's best to leave it to the flight crew. They're trained for these situations, right?" Michelle's voice rose a notch, catching the attention of nearby passengers. "That's what they all say until it's too late to do anything about it. I know I'm not the only one feeling this way." A few heads turned to glance at David, who remained oblivious, quietly reading his book. In the aisle, Linda caught sight of the gathering attention around Michelle and immediately moved in her direction. She leaned in, her voice steady but firm. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down. Let's not alarm other passengers. What seems to be the issue?" Michelle gestured toward David, her expression filled with determination. "I'm telling you, that man is acting suspiciously. He keeps reaching for his bag, checking it over and over. Something's not right." Linda took a deep breath, her tone reassuring yet firm. "Ma'am, we've been monitoring the situation, but there's no evidence of any threat. Please, try to stay calm." Michelle's frustration boiled over as she crossed her arms and muttered, Everyone's too afraid to act until it's too late. But as Michelle's gaze returned to David, her suspicions refused to die down. She was sure something was dangerously wrong, and she might be the only one brave enough to do something about it. As Flight 287 continued to cut through the clouds, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. The mood among the passengers shifted, with most oblivious to the tension simmering a few rows back. Some remained focused on books or movies, while others dozed peacefully. Yet Michelle's eyes stayed fixed on David, her suspicions hardening with each passing minute. Meanwhile, David, completely unaware of the scrutiny, adjusted his seat and took a sip from his water bottle. Glancing out the window at the vast stretch of sky, his calm demeanor seemed to agitate Michelle even more. How could he look so unbothered, so completely at ease? She clenched her hands around her armrests, trying to control the racing thoughts spiraling through her mind. Every story she'd ever seen about normal-looking people who later turned out to be threats flashed in her head. She couldn't ignore this feeling. Finally, she leaned over to the middle-aged woman sitting next to her, trying yet again to find an ally. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice tinged with urgency. "Do you see that man near the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem suspicious to you?" The woman, who had been absorbed in her book, looked up, her expression puzzled. She glanced at David, who had returned to his reading. "Suspicious? He just seems like he's keeping to himself," she replied cautiously, her tone betraying a hint of discomfort. Michelle's frustration flared. "He keeps checking his bag over and over like he's got something dangerous in there," she pressed, her voice lowering but filled with conviction. "I told the flight attendants, but no one's taking it seriously. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry?" The woman looked back at David briefly, then turned back to Michelle with a polite but dismissive shrug. "I'm sure if there were any real issues, the crew would handle it. He's just reading." This dismissal only fueled Michelle's determination. She glanced around, feeling the growing weight of her isolation. How could everyone else be so complacent? For all she knew, David's calmness was an act, a way to disguise his true intentions. If no one else would act, she would have to. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand again, signaling for Linda. When Linda approached, Michelle gestured toward David, her voice a tense whisper. "Look, I know I already mentioned this, but I really think you need to do something about that man. He's been checking his bag constantly since we boarded. I'm telling you, something's not right." Linda's professional smile barely faltered as she glanced over at David, who was flipping a page in his book, seemingly oblivious. "Ma'am, I assure you we've been monitoring the situation, and there's no reason for concern," Linda said gently. "We want all passengers to feel safe, but so far he hasn't done anything to justify further action." Michelle's patience had reached its limit. "How can you just ignore this?" she whispered, her voice edging with frustration. "People like him, they always look normal until something happens. I don't understand why no one else is seeing this." Linda held Michelle's gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, we're trained to recognize threats, and there is currently no reason to believe that Mr. Lewis is one. Please try to relax. If you observe anything concrete, don't hesitate to let us know." Michelle crossed her arms and huffed as Linda walked away, feeling both frustrated and dismissed. She watched Linda move down the aisle, exchanging quick words with another flight attendant. But despite Michelle's urgency, Linda didn't appear any more concerned than before. Undeterred, Michelle scanned the cabin, hoping to catch the eye of anyone who might see things her way. Her gaze landed on a young man seated a few rows away, who had been glancing at her curiously during the exchange with Linda. She leaned toward him, her voice low but filled with purpose. "Did you see that man near the exit? He's been acting suspicious, checking his bag like he's hiding something dangerous. Doesn't that concern you?" The young man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, casting a hesitant glance at David, who still seemed absorbed in his book. I guess he seems fine to me, probably just nervous about something," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Honestly, I think if there were a problem, the flight crew would be on it." Michelle's patience snapped. She leaned back in her seat, frustration spilling over. "You're all too trusting. That's exactly what they count on, no one willing to stand up and do something." Her voice rose, catching the attention of more passengers around her. Linda, who had been nearby, immediately moved toward Michelle, her expression calm but serious. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your voice down. We don't want to alarm the other passengers. What seems to be the problem now?" Michelle gestured toward David, her eyes narrowed. "I've told you. He's acting strange. Keeps checking that bag over and over. I know he's hiding something." Linda took a slow, steady breath, her tone level. "Ma'am, we've spoken about this. There's no indication of any threat. I'm going to ask you to remain calm and stay in your seat." Michelle's frustration reached a boiling point. She glared at Linda, crossing her arms. "You're all ignoring this until it's too late," she muttered under her breath. "Bookmark?" As she glanced back at David, her thoughts churned. If no one else would take her seriously, she might have to step up and do something herself. Michelle's suspicions were now an unyielding force, her mind racing with possibilities she couldn't ignore. She clenched her hands on the armrests, her heartbeat quickening as she watched David's every subtle move. Each time he reached for his bag or glanced calmly out the window, she felt her urgency grow. It was as if she could see beneath the surface, beyond the composed facade he presented to everyone else. Meanwhile, David felt a faint discomfort, though he couldn't quite pinpoint its source. Shifting in his seat, he caught Michelle's piercing stare and felt a flicker of irritation. He shook it off, returning his focus to his book, reminding himself he was here to escape from the demands of his job, not to play into a stranger's baseless suspicions. Still, Michelle's mind whirled with anxiety. Every news story about seemingly normal people who turned out to be threats replayed vividly in her mind. She scanned the cabin, frustrated at how the other passengers seemed so unbothered, casually engaged in their own worlds. How could they not see what was right in front of them? If no one else was willing to act, she realized, then she would. Determined, Michelle unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, earning curious glances from those nearby. She made her way down the aisle until she reached Linda, who was busy with another passenger's request. Linda turned, taken aback by Michelle's sudden approach, and offered a calm smile, though her eyes showed a hint of strain. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Linda asked, her voice careful and polite. "Please return to your seat." Michelle leaned in, her tone urgent and low. "I've been telling you that man near the exit is hiding something dangerous in his bag. He keeps checking it over and over. Can't you see? This could be serious." Linda took a deep breath, keeping her expression composed. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we can't search a passenger's bag without clear evidence of a threat. I've been monitoring the situation, and there's no reason for alarm. Please return to your seat and let us handle it." Michelle shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "You don't understand. This could be life or death. I've been watching him. He's up to something." Linda's tone hardened, her patience waning. "Ma'am, we are trained to recognize potential threats, and there's currently no reason to believe Mr. Lewis poses any danger. Please take your seat, or I'll need to involve the captain. We have to prioritize everyone's comfort and safety." Feeling dismissed, Michelle turned back toward David, her mind racing. If she couldn't rely on the flight attendants to act, then she would have to take matters into her own hands. With that, she moved purposefully back toward David, her resolve unshakable. David looked up, clearly surprised as Michelle stopped beside him, her eyes blazing. He met her gaze with a raised eyebrow, caught off guard by her determined stance. "Is there something you need, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with confusion. Michelle's voice was strong, just loud enough for those around them to hear. "Actually, yes. I'd like to know what you're hiding in that bag. You've been checking it over and over, and it's making everyone uneasy." David felt his patience start to slip as passengers nearby began casting curious glances in his direction. He took a steadying breath, looking her directly in the eye. "Ma'am, I'm not hiding anything. My bag contains personal items, and I'd appreciate it if you'd allow me to enjoy my flight in peace, just like everyone else." But Michelle wasn't about to be swayed. Her voice rose with frustration, catching the attention of several passengers who had been trying to mind their own business. "You expect us to believe that? I've been watching you since we boarded, and something isn't right. I demand that you open that bag right now." David met her accusation with a composed expression, though his annoyance was clear. He raised his hand slightly, speaking in a measured tone. "Ma'am, there's nothing in my bag that concerns you or anyone else. Please, take your seat." Linda hurried over, sensing the tension escalating quickly. She stepped between them, her voice low but firm. "Ma'am, that's enough. You're disturbing the other passengers. Please return to your seat." Michelle stood her ground. "I'm not moving until he opens that bag. He could be hiding something dangerous, and you're just sitting here ignoring it." David let out a slow breath and glanced around, feeling the weight of the stairs on him. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he unzipped his bag, pulling out a clear plastic case containing prescription medication. "This is what's in my bag. It's medication for a heart condition. Now, can I please have some peace?" Linda exhaled with relief and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis." She turned to Michelle, her tone now stern. "Ma'am, you can see now that there's nothing to worry about. Please return to your seat." But Michelle was unconvinced. She glanced around the cabin, trying to meet the eyes of any passenger who might share her suspicions. "No, that can't be it," she muttered. "He has to be hiding something else. I know it." As Linda guided her firmly back to her seat, Michelle's suspicion only deepened. She might be the only one left watching, but she wouldn't look away. Bookmark go back. Michelle's suspicions had now solidified into an unshakable certainty. She clenched her fists, her gaze locked on David, who sat a few rows ahead, seemingly relaxed. To Michelle, his calmness only proved her point. There was something wrong about him, something she was sure everyone else was too naive or too scared to see. Her chest tightened as she thought about the consequences of inaction. She couldn't let this slide. Meanwhile, David felt the intensity of her stare, like a weight on his back. He shifted in his seat, letting out a tense breath, but tried to ignore her. All he wanted was to enjoy a quiet flight. Yet, Michelle's glaring eyes, filled with suspicion, were unsettling. For the first time, he felt a flicker of anxiety creep in. He turned back to his book, flipping through pages he could barely focus on. Around them, the other passengers began to sense that something was brewing. Some shot curious glances toward Michelle, while others shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. Each time she noticed someone looking, Michelle gave them a pleading look, silently asking them to understand. Unable to stay silent, Michelle leaned toward an elderly man beside her, her voice a harsh whisper. "Can't you see he's hiding something? No one is paying attention. It's like they're all protecting him." The elderly man blinked in surprise, glancing at David briefly, before looking back at Michelle. "Ma'am, he doesn't look like he's doing anything wrong," he said cautiously, turning his focus back to his crossword puzzle, though his hand trembled slightly. Michelle's patience snapped. She stood up abruptly, her voice rising as she addressed the cabin. "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" she demanded, pointing at David. "Am I the only one here concerned for our safety? This man has been acting strange since we boarded, and you're all just sitting here ignoring it." The quiet cabin grew tense as her voice cut through the hum of the engines. Heads turned, passengers sat up straighter, and uneasy murmurs spread through the rows. Linda, seeing the shift in attention, immediately made her way down the aisle, her expression firm yet calm. "Ma'am," Linda said quietly but with authority, positioning herself between Michelle and David, "I need you to sit down. Your behavior is disrupting the flight, and I need you to remain calm." But Michelle wasn't backing down. "Don't you see? He's dangerous. I can feel it, and if no one's going to do anything, I will." She looked around at the other passengers, hoping to find even one person who understood her concerns. But most of them quickly looked away, avoiding her gaze. David finally looked up, his patience fraying. Meeting her eyes, he spoke in a steady voice. "I don't know what you think I've done, but I'm just sitting here trying to enjoy my flight like everyone else. Please leave me alone." Michelle's voice sharpened, her tone defiant. "That's what they all say. It's always the ones who act innocent, who stay calm until they don't. I know what I saw." Her hands shook as she pointed directly at him. "Show us what's in that bag again. I demand that you prove there's nothing dangerous in there." Linda, sensing the escalation, stepped between them, her tone steely. "Ma'am, this is enough. Please sit down, or I'll be forced to involve the captain. I'm asking you one last time to keep your voice down and remain calm." Michelle glared at her, crossing her arms defiantly. The captain? Go ahead. Maybe he'll finally do something about this. She turned back to the surrounding passengers, raising her voice as she addressed them. Am I really the only one concerned? Are you all just going to sit here and ignore the danger right in front of you? Passengers shifted in their seats, some of them now visibly nervous. A few glanced at David, casting uncertain looks in his direction, while others whispered among themselves, uncomfortable with the rising tension. Linda, seeing that Michelle's outburst was creating a real disturbance, exchanged a look with James, another flight attendant nearby. She gave him a nod, signaling him to notify the captain. She then turned back to Michelle, her voice firmer than before. Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat now. You're making other passengers uncomfortable, and your accusations are baseless. This is your last warning. Michelle ignored her, her gaze locked on David, who now watched her with a mixture of confusion and frustration. I don't care what you think. This man is a threat, and if none of you will act, I will. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. A few passengers leaned out into the aisle to watch, while others seemed to shrink back, clearly wanting no part of the escalating conflict. David took a deep breath, then reached down and unzipped his bag once more, holding up the clear plastic case of medication for everyone to see. This is what's in my bag, he said, his voice steady but exasperated. It's heart medication. That's it. I don't know what you think is happening here, but you're mistaken. Linda gave him a grateful nod, then turned to Michelle, her tone no longer diplomatic. Ma'am, you can see now there's no reason for alarm. Please sit down, or I will involve security upon landing. Michelle's face flushed as she looked around, seeking support from the other passengers, but seeing only wary expressions and a few looks of sympathy directed toward David. She huffed, crossing her arms, muttering under her breath, He's hiding something. You'll all see eventually. As Michelle sat back down, the cabin remained tense, with the eyes of everyone darting nervously between her and David, wondering if the confrontation was truly over or just beginning. Linda straightened, her professional demeanor masking the anxiety building inside her. She gave a quick nod to James, who slipped into the cockpit to inform Captain Roberts of the escalating situation. The captain was known for his calm and authoritative approach, and she hoped he'd be able to help restore order before things got worse. In the cockpit, James explained the situation, and Captain Roberts listened intently, his expression serious. Let the passenger know I'll be out shortly to address the concerns directly, he said, adjusting his headset. He gave a nod to the co-pilot, signaling for him to maintain the course as he prepared to enter the cabin. When Captain Roberts finally appeared at the front of the cabin, his presence commanded immediate attention. Tall and calm, with a reassuring air, he made his way down the aisle, his gaze steady. Passengers, some visibly tense, looked up at him, hoping his arrival would diffuse the uncomfortable atmosphere that had spread through the cabin. Stopping beside Linda and James, the captain spoke in a low voice. Which passenger is causing the disturbance? Linda nodded subtly in Michelle's direction. She's expressed concerns about another passenger, sir, and it's becoming disruptive. Captain Roberts took a deep breath, then approached Michelle with a calm but firm demeanor. Ma'am, he began in a controlled tone, I'm Captain Roberts. I understand you have concerns about another passenger, but I must ask you to remain seated and avoid disturbing others. Michelle's eyes flashed with renewed determination as she looked up at him. Captain, I'm telling you, that man has been acting suspiciously since we boarded. I don't care if he's shown his bag already, there's something wrong, and you're just sitting here, ignoring it. Captain Roberts maintained his calm, nodding slowly. I understand that you may be feeling uneasy, but please know that every passenger and their belongings went through thorough security screenings. Mr. Lewis has done nothing to indicate any danger. We need to keep the flight calm for everyone on board, which includes respecting the personal space of others. Michelle crossed her arms, her jaw set. I've seen people like him on the news, Captain. They act normal until it's too late, and no one does anything until disaster strikes. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you that this is a serious threat. Captain Roberts's expression shifted slightly, though his voice remained even. Ma'am, I am responsible for the safety of everyone on this flight. And if you persist in causing a disturbance, I will have no choice but to involve security upon landing." For a brief moment, Michelle looked around the cabin, her gaze searching for any signs of agreement from the other passengers. Instead, she saw only wary expressions, some looking at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. She was alone in her conviction, and the realization only seemed to harden her resolve. Turning back to the captain, she said in a low, defiant voice, "Fine, but when something goes wrong, just remember, I warned you." Captain Roberts met her gaze evenly, then gave a respectful nod. "Thank you for understanding, ma'am. I'd like you to stay seated for the remainder of the flight. If you feel you need to discuss this further, we'll have someone meet you at the gate." He turned back, signaling to Linda and James to resume their duties, while he returned to the cockpit, satisfied he had done everything possible to keep the situation under control. Linda remained by Michelle's row a moment longer. Watching as she settled back into her seat, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. As Linda moved down the aisle, her gaze shifted to David, who sat calmly, though the tension in his shoulders was evident. She leaned down, her voice soft. "Mr. Lewis, I apologize for the inconvenience. Thank you for your patience." David nodded politely. "Thank you, but I'd just like to have a quiet rest of the flight," he replied, his tone carrying a subtle edge of weariness. Linda gave a small, sympathetic nod, then continued down the aisle, greeting the other passengers with a reassuring smile. The cabin gradually began to settle, though an undercurrent of unease lingered, punctuated by Michelle's occasional glares at David. The minutes dragged by, the usual drone of the engines seeming heavier in the silence that had settled over the cabin. Michelle's mind was racing, frustration growing as she noticed that none of the other passengers seemed to share her sense of urgency. She glanced around, hoping to catch someone's eye, but everyone seemed determined to look anywhere but at her. Finally, she leaned toward the elderly man beside her, whispering, "You don't believe them, do you? They're just trying to keep things calm, but that doesn't mean he's not a threat. Don't you feel it too?" The elderly man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, keeping his eyes on his crossword puzzle. "Ma'am, I think if there were something to be concerned about, the captain would handle it. Let's just try to get through the rest of the flight peacefully." Michelle clenched her fists, her frustration almost overwhelming. How could everyone be so blind? She shot another look at David, watching as he took a sip of water and returned his attention to his book. To her, his calmness was an act, a practiced deception hiding something dangerous. David, though doing his best to focus, couldn't shake the feeling of her intense scrutiny. The repeated glances and the whispered conversations with other passengers all built into a quiet pressure that was impossible to ignore. He shifted slightly, casting a quick look over his shoulder, only to find Michelle's gaze fixed firmly on him. For the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine unease. Linda, passing by, caught the look of tension between the two, and made a mental note to check in with Michelle again if necessary. She knew Captain Roberts's intervention should have settled the situation, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained thick, as if everyone was waiting for the next spark. Go back. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin thickened. Michelle sat rigidly in her seat, her gaze locked on David. Every time he shifted in his seat or reached down to adjust his bag, her suspicions flared anew. The captain's warning had done nothing to settle her mind. In fact, it only fueled her determination. She wasn't going to be quieted by anyone, not when she believed there was a genuine danger on board. David, meanwhile, could feel the weight of her scrutiny like a tangible force pressing against him. Though he tried to appear calm, his patience was wearing thin. He glanced around, aware of the eyes of other passengers flitting between him and Michelle, their whispers filling the cabin with a low murmur. He wondered how long this unsettling atmosphere would last. All he wanted was for the flight to proceed peacefully, but Michelle's relentless gaze and the mounting pressure were making that increasingly difficult. Linda, ever attentive, noticed the tension simmering throughout the cabin. She exchanged a look with James, who gave her a slight nod as if to say, "Stay alert." Linda knew that if Michelle's suspicions continued unchecked, it could escalate beyond what the crew could manage. She took a steadying breath, silently hoping that Michelle would back down. But something in her gut told her that wasn't going to happen. Suddenly, Michelle leaned over toward the young woman across the aisle, her voice a harsh whisper tinged with desperation. "You see him, don't you? He keeps checking that bag. Doesn't that seem strange to you?" The young woman looked uncomfortable, casting a quick glance at David before responding quietly. I think maybe he's just nervous, ma'am. You know, some people fidget when they're anxious." Michelle shook her head, her voice sharp. "Nervous? That's what he wants you to think. He's trying to act innocent, but I've seen this before. I know what I'm talking about. People like him act relaxed until they make their move." The young woman's expression shifted from discomfort to irritation, her patience clearly waning. She turned away, mumbling, "Please, ma'am, let's just finish the flight." Michelle's frustration only intensified. It was as if everyone around her was blind, incapable of seeing what she believed was blatantly obvious. Her chest tightened with the anxiety of being the only one aware of an impending threat. She glanced around once more, searching for even a single passenger who might understand her concern, but every face was turned away, unwilling to engage. Determined not to let this go, Michelle raised her hand again, signaling for Linda, who approached with a calm but wary expression. "Yes, ma'am, what can I help you with?" she asked, though there was a trace of caution in her tone. Michelle gestured toward David. "I'm telling you, he's hiding something. I don't care if he's shown his bag before. He keeps looking at it like he's checking to make sure it's still there. Something's off, and you're all just sitting here ignoring it." Linda kept her voice low, trying not to draw further attention. "Ma'am, we've gone through this already. Mr. Lewis has shown his belongings, and there's no evidence of any threat. Please, for the comfort of the other passengers, let's avoid further disruption." Michelle's tone grew louder, exasperation clear in her voice. "Comfort? What about everyone's safety? You're ignoring a potential threat because it's inconvenient. That man is hiding something, and I won't be silent about it." Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, some casting irritated glances her way, while others looked at David with newfound suspicion. The murmur of voices grew louder, a few people now exchanging nervous whispers as Michelle's accusations lingered in the air. David finally had enough. He turned toward Michelle, his expression calm, but his voice edged with frustration. "Ma'am, I've already shown what's in my bag. It's medication and personal belongings, nothing more. I don't know why you insist on accusing me, but I'd appreciate it if you'd stop causing a scene." But Michelle wasn't swayed. "Of course you'd say that. It's people like you, people who seem too calm, that everyone overlooks. You can fool everyone else, but I see right through it." Linda raised her hand, interjecting before the tension could escalate further. "Ma'am, this is enough. If you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll be forced to take measures to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. I'm going to ask you one last time to remain calm and allow us to manage the situation." Michelle's expression was defiant, but she felt the weight of Linda's words. She looked around the cabin once more, noticing the disapproving looks of several passengers. Begrudgingly, she sank back into her seat, crossing her arms, her eyes still locked on David. Linda gave David an apologetic nod before stepping back. "Thank you, sir, for your patience," she said quietly, then turned to address the other passengers, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The situation is under control. We apologize for the disturbance and appreciate your cooperation." A few sighs of relief rippled through the cabin, but Michelle's gaze remained fixed on David, her frustration and fear palpable. Despite Linda's reassurances, she couldn't shake the conviction that something terrible was being ignored. Though silenced for now, Michelle's suspicions simmered, her mind racing with possibilities. If no one else would act, she would be ready. Michelle's heart pounded as she settled back into her seat, her thoughts racing with frustration. How could everyone around her be so blind? She tightened her grip on the armrests, her eyes never leaving David, who had resumed reading, oblivious to the gaze fixed on him. Each page he turned, each casual sip of water, only solidified her belief that he was hiding something beneath his calm facade. David, trying his best to ignore the tension, could still feel the weight of Michelle's stare, and the whispers that rippled through the rows behind him. He forced himself to focus on his book, flipping pages even though he wasn't processing a word. What had started as a quiet flight had now turned into an ordeal. The woman behind him seemed relentless, and he could only hope her suspicions would fade as the hours dragged on. Yet, Michelle's resolve didn't weaken. If anything, it strengthened. She continued glancing around, watching as passengers avoided her gaze or exchanged uncomfortable looks. She leaned toward the young man across the aisle, her voice barely a whisper. "Can't you feel it? There's something off about him. I'm just trying to keep everyone safe." The young man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her with a faint frown. "Ma'am, I'm sure if there were any real danger, the crew would handle it. It's probably best to leave it to them." Michelle's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, her frustration seeping through. That's exactly what they count on, people sitting back, doing nothing. By the time anyone realizes, it's already too late. She sat back, crossing her arms tightly. "You'll all see, eventually." Beside her, the elderly man she had spoken to earlier shifted slightly, trying to focus on his crossword puzzle but unable to shake the tension. He cleared his throat, glancing at Michelle. "Ma'am, I think everyone here just wants to finish the flight peacefully. Maybe it's best to let it go." Michelle's jaw clenched, feeling as though the entire cabin had turned against her. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, but the fire in her eyes didn't die down. If she had to be the only one on alert, so be it. She would remain vigilant, ready to act if the need arose. Across the aisle, Linda watched with a careful eye, exchanging a look with James as he passed by. She could see the toll this situation was taking on the passengers, the subtle discomfort spreading through the rows. But she also knew that directly confronting Michelle again could lead to another outburst, something they were all hoping to avoid. Minutes turned into an hour, and the hum of the engines filled the silence that had settled in the cabin. Despite Linda's calming presence, Michelle's suspicion lingered, her gaze darting back to David with every slight movement he made. Each time he reached into his bag or adjusted his seat, her breath hitched, her mind racing with possibilities. Unable to stand it any longer, Michelle leaned over to the elderly man beside her once again. "Just watch him," she whispered, a hint of desperation in her tone. "He's going to slip up. I just know it." The elderly man glanced at her, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "Ma'am, please, let's just finish the flight in peace. Everyone's already on edge." Michelle gave him a tight-lipped nod, feeling the frustration twist inside her. She could feel the walls closing in, the isolation settling over her as no one seemed willing to acknowledge the threat she believed was so obvious. She glanced back at David, who remained calm, unbothered by the scene that had unfolded around him. It was almost infuriating. David, meanwhile, was doing his best to stay focused, but he could still feel Michelle's gaze burning into him. He let out a slow breath, hoping to project calm, though inwardly he was exhausted by the constant tension. He could sense that the other passengers were growing irritated, that the unease in the cabin was palpable. Linda, noticing the subtle shift in energy, quietly walked by David's row, offering him a nod of reassurance. She knew that keeping things calm was crucial, and that meant watching both Michelle and David closely to ensure no further confrontations erupted. She could only hope that her presence would be enough to prevent Michelle from reigniting the situation. As the plane continued its steady course, the tension hung like a cloud over the cabin. Passengers who had initially been disinterested were now casting wary glances toward Michelle, her rigid posture and fixed stare unsettling them. The flight that had started as a simple journey was now marked by an undercurrent of silent tension, an awareness that something was wrong, even if no one could quite articulate it. The hum of the engines, once comforting, now felt like a thin barrier between the passengers and the discomfort that had taken hold. The young woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, glancing at Michelle, then back at her own book, her focus broken. The elderly man next to Michelle sighed, folding his crossword puzzle in resignation. And yet, through it all, Michelle's gaze never left David. She told herself she was protecting everyone, that her vigilance was the only thing keeping them safe. She didn't care if she was the only one. She would keep her eyes open, ready for any sign that might confirm her suspicions. Bookmark. As the cabin settled into an uneasy silence, Michelle's conviction only grew stronger. Alone or not, she would be the one to stop any threat, even if it meant watching until the very end. As the flight stretched on, the cabin remained cloaked in an uncomfortable silence, a palpable tension hanging over the rows of passengers. Michelle's suspicion had grown into an almost feverish intensity. Every small move David made, a glance out the window, a slight adjustment in his seat, fueled her conviction. She told herself that she was the only one truly vigilant, the only one capable of preventing a potential catastrophe. David, on the other hand, was struggling to ignore the continuous stare drilling into his back. He shifted slightly, glancing toward the aisle where Linda stood, her watchful gaze roaming over the passengers. His patience was wearing thin, and he could feel the discomfort from other passengers as they shot wary glances in Michelle's direction. He tried to focus on his book, but the tension gnawed at him, making concentration impossible. Eventually, unable to contain herself any longer, Michelle unbuckled her seatbelt, rose, and took a deliberate step toward David's seat. Her movement drew the attention of several nearby passengers, who exchanged uneasy looks, their curiosity piqued by the escalation. As she moved down the aisle, Linda noticed immediately, her eyes narrowing with concern. She quickly intercepted Michelle, positioning herself between her and David. "Ma'am, I must insist that you'd return to your seat," Linda said, her tone firm but calm. She glanced at the other passengers, sensing their growing discomfort. The last thing she wanted was a scene, but Michelle's expression was one of fierce determination. "No," Michelle replied, her voice unwavering. "I won't sit back any longer. He's hiding something, and you're all just ignoring it." She pointed at David, her hand trembling. "I demand you check his bag again. This isn't just about me feeling uneasy. This is about everyone's safety." Linda took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, though she could feel the weight of the passengers' stares. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down. Mr. Lewis has already cooperated fully. I need you to respect his privacy and the comfort of those around you." David looked up, meeting Michelle's gaze with a steady calm that seemed to infuriate her further. He spoke softly but firmly. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think I've done, but I'm here for the same reason everyone else is, to get to my destination. I'm asking you to please let this go." But Michelle's frustration boiled over. That's what people always say. They act innocent, they blend in, and everyone around them pretends not to see the signs. But I see them, and I won't ignore this. She looked around, searching the faces of nearby passengers, her tone rising. "Can't you see he's hiding something?" A few passengers exchanged looks of unease, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Some glanced toward David, who sat with a controlled expression, his hands resting on his book. The situation was spiraling, and the cabin felt charged, every passenger holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Linda stepped forward, her voice firmer than before. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. You are causing a disturbance, and if this continues, we will be forced to involve security upon landing. I need you to return to your seat and remain quiet." Michelle's eyes blazed with anger as she looked between Linda and David, her voice low but intense. "You're all making a mistake, but fine, if no one else will do something, I will." She leaned forward, pointing directly at David. "What are you hiding in that bag? Show everyone right now, or I'll make sure you can't hide anything anymore." David closed his book, his expression no longer neutral. He looked up at her, a hint of exasperation in his eyes. "I've already shown you what's in my bag. I'm here for a peaceful flight, but if this continues, you're going to make it impossible for anyone to have one." Linda, seeing the situation reaching a breaking point, turned to James, giving him a subtle signal. James nodded and quietly stepped toward the cockpit to inform the captain, who needed to be aware of the escalating conflict. Michelle's patience finally snapped. She moved as if to reach for David's bag, her expression one of fierce determination, but before she could touch it, David gently but firmly took her wrist, stopping her. His voice was steady, but his words carried a clear warning. "Ma'am, please, enough is enough. You need to respect my space." Linda quickly stepped between them, her voice sharp. "Ma'am, that's enough. Please return to your seat immediately. If you cannot comply, we will be forced to take further action." Michelle pulled her hand back, her face flushed, her eyes burning with disbelief and anger. She looked around, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You're all in on this, aren't you? You're all just protecting him. I'm the only one who sees the truth. And if something happens, it's on all of you." Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring among themselves, their expressions a mixture of confusion and irritation. David, however, held his ground, his posture calm, yet resolute. He understood that any reaction could further escalate the situation, so he chose to remain silent, his gaze meeting Linda's in a shared understanding. Linda took a deep breath, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Ma'am, please come with me to the back of the plane. We need to have a conversation in private. Let's avoid any more disruption for the other passengers." For a moment, it seemed Michelle might resist, but seeing the growing disapproval in the eyes of those around her, she reluctantly nodded. With a final glare at David, she followed Linda to the back of the plane, her steps slow and heavy, her mind still racing with suspicions and accusations. As they reached the back, Linda leaned close, her voice calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, we're doing everything we can to ensure this flight is safe, but I need you to remain in your seat for the rest of the journey. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have no choice but have security meet you upon landing." Michelle crossed her arms, her face set in defiance. "You are all blind to the danger. You'll regret this," she muttered, sinking back into her seat. Though seemingly settled for now, the charged silence in the cabin lingered, leaving everyone wondering if the conflict was truly over, or if something bigger was. The plane continued on its path, cruising steadily as it approached its destination. Although the confrontation had subsided, a tense silence lingered throughout the cabin, the energy still charged from Michelle's outburst. Passengers sat in uneasy quiet, exchanging glances filled with uncertainty, wondering what might happen next. Michelle sat in her seat, arms crossed, frustration radiating off her. She had been effectively warned, but it didn't matter. She was more convinced than ever that everyone else was wrong. As the minutes ticked by, she occasionally glanced around, hoping to catch someone's eye, to find at least one person who shared her concern. But the other passengers were done with her outbursts. Some cast disapproving glances her way. Others simply averted their eyes, unwilling to engage. Meanwhile, David was doing his best to focus, although the earlier confrontation had shaken him. He kept his gaze fixed on the book in his hands, flipping through the pages with an outwardly calm demeanor. But inside, he was anxious, aware that Michelle's accusations had left a shadow over the flight. Her scrutiny, the whispered conversations, the tension that refused to fade, all of it weighed on him. Linda moved quietly through the aisles, her expression a practiced mask of calm, although she was keenly aware of the lingering discomfort among the passengers. She occasionally checked on Michelle, who sat simmering in silence, and then on David, who had maintained his composure throughout. She could only hope the remaining flight would pass without incident. The captain's voice soon broke through the silence, announcing their descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for our arrival. Thank you for your cooperation." Michelle's jaw tightened as the announcement filled the cabin. She looked over at David once more, her suspicions as sharp as ever. She whispered to the elderly man beside her, unable to hold back. "You'll see. Once we land, they'll regret not listening to me. I know something's off." The elderly man, exhausted from her continuous accusations, offered her a polite but strained smile, then turned his attention to the window, clearly done with the conversation. Michelle huffed quietly, feeling the isolation settle in further, but her mind was still whirling with scenarios, each one affirming her conviction that she was right. David, sensing the glances still being cast his way, took a deep breath, steeling himself for the landing and whatever questions might follow. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but Michelle's accusations had left a ripple effect, and he could feel it in the eyes of those around him. As the plane began its descent, Linda and James exchanged a look, both of them ready to step in if Michelle made any further outbursts. The flight had been tense enough, and both of them wanted nothing more than to bring it to a safe, peaceful conclusion. Michelle sat rigid, watching David as if she expected him to reveal his true nature at any moment. Every slight movement he made seemed to fuel her belief that he was dangerous, and her fingers gripped the armrests as the plane descended lower. Finally, with a slight jolt, the plane touched down, rolling smoothly along the runway before coming to a gradual stop at the gate. Passengers sighed in relief, the tension briefly easing as they prepared to disembark. The familiar sound of seatbelts clicking open filled the cabin, and people began gathering their belongings, eager to leave the tense atmosphere behind. David remained seated, choosing to let others pass before him. He knew that being among the last to exit would allow him a quieter departure, away from the stares and whispers that had followed him throughout the flight. Linda, who was stationed nearby, gave him an encouraging nod, a silent reassurance that she understood his desire for a calm exit. But Michelle wasn't done. She stayed seated, her gaze never leaving David as other passengers filed out around her. The anger that had simmered within her all flight was now at a rolling boil, her sense of vindication overpowering any caution she'd been urged to exercise. As the crowd thinned, she stood up, ready to confront David one last time if necessary. Suddenly, 2 uniformed security officers boarded the plane, their presence instantly capturing the attention of those who remained seated. Linda and James, who had anticipated potential disruption, had informed the airport's security team in advance. The officers moved purposefully down the aisle, stopping near Michelle. "Ma'am," one of the officers said in a calm, firm voice, "we need you to come with us. We'd like to speak with you about the situation during the flight." Michelle's face went pale, her eyes darting around as she glanced between the officers and David, her expression one of disbelief. "What? You should be questioning him," she said, her voice rising. "I'm not the problem here. He's the one you should be looking into." The second officer maintained a calm, professional demeanor. "We've been informed of your concerns, ma'am, but for now, we need you to accompany us. Any further details can be addressed after we've exited the plane." Seeing no support from the remaining passengers, and with the officer's calm authority firmly in place, Michelle reluctantly nodded, her gaze lingering on David with a look of unshakable suspicion as she was escorted off the plane. David exhaled, the relief evident in his posture. Linda offered him a reassuring smile as the remaining passengers exited, some glancing back with lingering curiosity and relief that the tense journey had finally ended. David gathered his belongings, stood up, and nodded to Linda, grateful for her steady presence. "Thank you for your patience," she said quietly, nodding back. David returned the gesture, his voice calm. "I appreciate how you handled it. I just want to move on from this." With a final nod, he exited the plane, stepping out into the bustling terminal, eager to leave the tension and accusations behind. As he walked into the terminal, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he couldn't shake the memory of the relentless suspicion he'd faced, wondering if Michelle's conviction had finally found its end. Bookmark. The moment Michelle stepped off the plane, the 2 security officers led her to a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the bustling crowds of newly arrived passengers. Her face was a mix of anger and indignation, her expression tense as she looked between the officers. She couldn't understand why they were focused on her, when, in her mind, the real threat had been allowed to walk away freely. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm demeanor, gestured to a nearby bench. "Please, ma'am, have a seat. We'd just like to ask you a few questions regarding the incident on your flight." Michelle hesitated but complied, sitting down with her arms crossed defensively. Her gaze was fierce as she looked up at the officers. "I don't know why you're talking to me when that man was the one acting suspiciously the entire flight," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "I was only trying to keep everyone safe. Why am I being treated like a criminal?" The second officer, a woman with a calm, empathetic tone, took a seat across from Michelle. "We understand that you were concerned, ma'am, but multiple reports from the flight attendants and passengers indicated that your actions caused a significant disturbance. Can you tell us, in your own words, what you observed?" Michelle took a deep breath, her expression unwavering. "From the moment he boarded, I could tell something was wrong. He kept looking at his bag, checking it over and over like he was hiding something. I pointed it out to the flight attendants, but they didn't take me seriously. No one would listen, and I couldn't just sit by while everyone ignored what was clearly a threat. The officers exchanged a glance before the woman nodded thoughtfully. And you're certain that this passenger, Mr. Lewis, posed an actual danger? Yes, Michelle insisted, her voice growing sharper. People like him, so calm, so collected, they always seem normal until it's too late. I wasn't going to take that risk. I was the only one willing to do something about it. The male officer kept his tone level. Ma'am, every passenger and their belongings go through strict security screenings before boarding. The flight crew reported that Mr. Lewis complied fully when asked to show the contents of his bag. There was no evidence of any threat. Michelle's mouth tightened, her frustration evident. So you're just going to ignore everything? The way he acted, the way he kept checking his bag, it was all an act, and you're letting him walk away because you'd rather believe everything's fine than listen to someone who actually saw the signs. The female officer remained calm, her voice steady. We appreciate that you were trying to keep your fellow passengers safe. But your actions caused anxiety among other passengers, and your continued insistence on confronting Mr. Lewis created a challenging environment for everyone involved. Michelle's eyes flashed and she shook her head. Fine, go ahead. Ignore me, just like they did, but don't say I didn't warn you. The male officer's expression softened slightly as he realized how deeply Michelle believed in her suspicions. We're not here to ignore you, ma'am. We want to ensure that every passenger feels secure, but we also have to balance those concerns with the comfort of everyone on board. Your concerns were addressed by the flight crew, and Mr. Pat Lewis's compliance demonstrated that there was no immediate danger. Seeing that she had no support, Michelle slumped slightly. Her earlier fire dimmed, but was not extinguished. You're all making a mistake, but I suppose I'll have to be the only one who sees that. The officers exchanged a final glance, realizing that no amount of explanation would change Michelle's mind. The female officer stood, offering Michelle a sympathetic smile. Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am. We'll be making a report, but for now, you're free to go. Michelle rose slowly, her gaze fixed ahead, still fuming. She walked away, her mind racing with indignation and disbelief. How could they all be so blind? In her eyes, she'd been the only one willing to act, the only one willing to risk everything to keep everyone safe, and now she was left feeling dismissed and isolated. Meanwhile, across the terminal, David was collecting his luggage, relieved to be moving forward from the ordeal on the plane. He rolled his suitcase along the bustling concourse, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The weight of the suspicions he'd endured throughout the flight was finally lifting, and he looked forward to putting the entire experience behind him. As he walked toward the exit, he spotted Linda, the flight attendant who had shown him empathy during the flight. She was speaking with a few other crew members, but when she saw him, she gave a small wave and approached. Mr. Lewis, she greeted him with a warm, genuine smile. I just wanted to apologize once more for everything that happened. Thank you for your patience. David returned the smile, grateful for her kindness. Thank you, Linda. I know it was a difficult situation for everyone involved. I appreciate how professionally you handled it. Linda nodded, her expression sincere. It's not every day we have a passenger so determined to, well, do what she believed was right, even if it created tension. I'm glad you're able to move on without holding it against anyone. David chuckled softly, relieved the ordeal was over. Just another story to add to my list of flight experiences, I suppose. With a final handshake, Linda returned to her crew, and David made his way to the exit, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city sprawled out before him, a place of new beginnings and new possibilities. The ordeal on the plane was already beginning to feel like a memory, something he could shake off as he walked forward, embracing the freedom and calm of solid ground. As David continued his journey, he felt a renewed sense of peace, leaving behind the tension of the flight and one passenger's unfounded fears, knowing he had finally put the whole ordeal behind him. Bookmark, go back. As David stepped outside into the crisp air of the terminal, the tension he had felt throughout the flight seemed to dissipate with each breath. The events of the journey lingered like a haze, but with every step away from the airport, he felt the weight of Michelle's unfounded suspicion lifting, leaving him with a renewed sense of calm. Meanwhile, Michelle found herself walking alone through the terminal, her mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. She replayed every moment, every glance she had shared with the other passengers who dismissed her, every disapproving look from the flight crew, and her anger simmered. How could they all have been so blind? In her eyes, she had been the only one willing to take a stand, to confront the threat she had perceived. But now, with the adrenaline fading, a flicker of doubt began to creep in. She cast a quick glance around, her frustration momentarily replaced by an awareness of how isolated she was. The world moved on around her, passengers reuniting with loved ones, smiling, laughing, while she stood still, a deep sense of frustration and confusion swirling within her. As David reached the exit, he took a final glance back at the airport, allowing himself a small, relieved smile. The city lights stretched before him, beckoning him forward, and he was ready to leave the tense memories of the flight behind. The relief was palpable. He could finally breathe without the weight of suspicion lingering over his shoulder. In a moment of reflection, he thought about Michelle's unwavering accusations. He wondered what had driven her to such certainty, how fear could distort someone's perception so fully. Despite the discomfort she had caused, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. Her fear, though misguided, had been genuine, and he could only hope she found peace. At the other end of the terminal, Michelle watched the crowd around her, feeling more alone than ever. As much as she wanted to hold on to her sense of righteousness, a strange, unsettling realization crept in. Had she been wrong? She clenched her fists, the frustration mingling with a faint sense of shame she couldn't quite admit to herself. She forced herself to shake off the thought, telling herself she had done what she believed was right. But a small, uncomfortable feeling settled in her chest, the tiniest seed of doubt beginning to sprout, though she pushed it down, refusing to let it take root. Her steps slowed as she left the terminal, the faces of the other passengers flashing in her mind, their dismissive looks, their refusal to see what she thought was so obvious. It left her with an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. Back on his path toward the city, David took in the bustling sights and sounds, allowing himself to be absorbed in the rhythm of the crowd. He was ready to embrace the possibilities of his journey, to meet new people, explore new places, and leave the unsettling flight behind him. He had faced challenges before, both in life and at work, but this one had left him with a new perspective. For David, the experience was a reminder of the power of perception. He thought about how easily fear could twist reality, how a simple gesture or look could be misinterpreted by someone driven by their own inner anxieties. It was a lesson, he realized, in patience and empathy. Sometimes people held on to their fears so tightly that they couldn't see the truth right in front of them. And perhaps, he thought, the best thing one could do in such situations was to remain calm, to not allow others' suspicions to affect one's sense of self. With a final deep breath, he let the thoughts drift away, leaving him with a feeling of closure as he stepped into the night, embracing the excitement of a new beginning. In the days that followed, both Michelle and David would carry the memory of the flight with them, though in very different ways. For Michelle, it became a story she would tell herself, a validation of her commitment to vigilance, though she would struggle with the quiet doubt that surfaced whenever she thought back to that moment. Her suspicion had come from a place of genuine concern, but somewhere along the way she realized it had grown into something she couldn't control. It left her wondering if perhaps, just maybe, she had let her fears consume her. For David, the experience remained as a quiet reminder of the resilience and patience he had gained from facing others' misunderstandings. He chose to leave the negativity behind, to see it as an exercise in holding on to his calm amid the storm. In his mind, he found a silver lining, a reminder of the importance of empathy, even for those who might cause us distress. He told himself that life, like the flight, was filled with unexpected turbulence, and the only thing he could control was how he responded. The flight had ended, but the impact of the journey left ripples in both of their lives, subtle shifts that neither of them could fully understand at that moment. and as each continued on their separate paths, they carried with them the quiet lessons from that shared experience. One person learning to let go of suspicion, the other finding strength in holding on to his own peace. Sometimes, life's turbulence reveals as much about others as it does about ourselves, reminding us that true peace often lies in learning when to hold on and when to let go. This story on the flight is more than a journey to a destination. It's a powerful look at how fear and assumptions can cloud our understanding of others. Michelle, with her intense suspicion, represents a familiar character. Someone who believes that vigilance is the only way to protect herself and those around her. However, in her quest for safety, she allowed fear to take control, ultimately losing sight of the calm, safe reality that had already been confirmed by others. On the other hand, David represents the power of patience and calm in the face of misunderstanding. He understands that while he may not be able to change others' perceptions, he can control his own reactions, remaining steady amidst a storm of doubt. This story reminds us of the importance of remaining grounded and empathetic, even when faced with others' misconceptions. Ultimately, we are reminded that fear can sometimes make us see threats where none exist, and acting on assumptions can lead to unnecessary harm. But in situations like these, we also learn the value of staying calm and empathetic toward ourselves and others alike. If you found this story engaging, comment with a 1. If you found it deeply moving, comment with a 2. And feel free to share any stories or thoughts of your own in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories coming soon. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this one.